It begins, as most peaceful stories should, with the rain tapping politely on a windowpane. Victorian England. The year is 1863. You're somewhere between breakfast and the long sigh that follows it. The sky, as usual, is grey, but a charming, poetic sort of grey. The kind of grey that makes everything else seem gentler by comparison. The kind of grey that makes you ponder tea, poetry, and the moral implications of dust. Inside, you walk past a parlor that smells faintly of bergamot boiled wool, and everything here is patterned. The wallpaper, the chair legs, even the emotions. You are visiting someone today. A woman named Eleanor, not Lady Eleanor, mind you, just Eleanor. Though she would never admit to being ordinary, she isn't quite grand enough for a title either. Somewhere comfortably in between. A woman with opinions on cake textures, cathedral ceilings, and most passionately ferns. The parlor is dim but pleasant. A low fire flickers like it's trying not to draw attention to itself. But what you notice, almost immediately, is the glass case in the corner. It looks a bit like a coffin, albeit a very polite, botanical sort of coffin. Inside it, a riot of ferns, soft green fronds curling upward like they're gossiping in silence. There's condensation beading along the top of the glass like the plants have been sighing dramatically. "Ah," says Eleanor, appearing beside you, unannounced. She's wearing a silk housecoat the color of apricot jam. "You've met my Wardian case." You nod slowly, because you're still not sure whether to treat it like a pet or a shrine. Victorians, you see, are a little obsessed with ferns. This isn't just Eleanor being Eleanor, it's everyone. The country is under a sort of green fever. They call it pteridamania, from the Greek pteris, meaning fern, and mania, meaning, well, mania. It sounds like a medical condition, and in some cases, perhaps it is. Pteridamania begins quietly, a frond in a teacup, a pressed specimen in a book, but soon it spreads. Ferns in frames, ferns on wallpaper, ferns stitched into handkerchiefs and under. You can even buy fern-themed soap, for reasons no one quite understands. There are fern clubs, fern walks, fern lectures. One man claimed to have identified 700 varieties of British fern, and seemed weirdly proud about it. Eleanor lifts the lid of the case like she's unveiling a treasure chest. Inside, the air is heavy with earthy damp. The smell is oddly comforting, like wet bark, moss, and childhood. I missed it twice a day, she says. More if it's anxious. You do not ask how she can tell when a plant is anxious. You simply nod again, as though it's obvious. The Wardian case's glass coffin-like structure is the real hero here. Invented by Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a London physician and amateur plant lover, who accidentally discovered in the 1820s that plants sealed in glass containers not only survived city pollution, they thrived. One day trapped a fern and a moth cocoon in a jar, and months later found both alive and seemingly quite pleased. This little accident revolutionized not just ferns but global trade. Wardian cases made it possible to ship live plants across oceans without them promptly dying of salty air. And English-size tea plants, rubber trees, orchids all smuggled politely under glass. But in homes like Eleanor's, the case is less about shipping and more about status. Ferns are delicate, refined. Owning one says, I am a person of taste, and I can afford controlled humidity. The same way today, someone might own a very large coffee machine they never use. Historians still debate whether Victorians loved ferns for their symmetry, their erotic symbolism, or simply because they were too bored to care about dogs. The truth is probably a little of each. A clock ticks gently in the hallway. You hear the sound of Eleanor's maid setting out tea. Time here moves like molasses downhill. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey and follow Eleanor on her peculiar, leafy day. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's alright. Neither did the moth in the jar. Before we go further, Eleanor insists you like this channel. She's very firm about it. She says, if you enjoy quiet stories about ferns and moral restraint, you'll want to subscribe. She also requests that you comment your location and local time, so she knows when to brew the tea. Now, step softly. The ferns are listening. You follow Eleanor through the drawing room, which is really just a fancier way of saying the room where no one actually draws. She is telling you at great length about the precise conditions required to keep a maidenhair fern from sulking. Apparently, they are the most emotionally unstable of the fern species, prone to despair and spontaneous front drop if exposed to a draft or an improper glance. You pass a bookshelf. Naturally, it's filled with botanical journals, pressed samples, and something called the Lady's Fern Companion, which sounds vaguely like a dating guide, but is mostly diagrams of chlorophyll. As Eleanor speaks, you try not to think too hard about the glass case again. It does look suspiciously coffin-like, doesn't it? But this is Victorian England. Everything looks a bit dead, including, sometimes, the food. In the hallway, a print hangs on the wall. A proud illustration of a fern ball society, where local ladies once gathered to discuss their best indoor specimens, sip elderflower cordial, and absolutely judge each other. One woman reportedly brought a 7-foot fern that required its own carriage. She was never invited back. Too much enthusiasm, not enough lace. You learned that the obsession with ferns had as much to do with class as You see, growing a fern required certain things: time, glass, and enough spare income to not use your windowsill for drying socks. This made it a popular hobby among the rising middle class, especially women who weren't allowed to collect fossils anymore after that unfortunate scandal involving a sea sponge and a bishop. One obscure custom among fern collectors, whispering compliments to the plant. Some Victorians believed ferns could sense approval. Lovely spores today, they might say. Very regal ricust. This was considered normal. Your plant had feelings. Your cat, less so. Eleanor pauses in front of her most prized possession, a curled albino fern, white as a spoonful of cream, framed in a shallow brass box. It's said to bring protection from melancholy, or at least start interesting dinner conversations. She looks at it like one might look at a long-lost friend or a very promising pudding. This one, she says softly, came from Cornwall, near a waterfall. I nearly fell in fetching it. You believe her. There's a glint of chaos in her eye that suggests she might walk into a stream just for botanical principle. As you listen, something curious strikes you. It's not just about ferns. Not really. It's about having a corner of the world you can care for. Something small, alive, and utterly unbothered by politics or petticoats. Something green and simple when everything else is grey and complicated. You look out the window, across the lane, another house, another glask, another woman misting her own tiny jungle with what you can only describe as religious fun. Everyone says, "I spoil them." Eleanor smiles, gesturing to the ferns. But how else should one behave toward survivors? You're not sure if she means the plants or the women. You suspect it's both. The fire crackles quietly. Somewhere, a church bell rings, muffled by drizzle. Eleanor offers you a biscuit. It tastes of dust and dignity. You are warm. You are vaguely confused. You are falling ever so slowly into the rhythm of fern time. And there are 13 more rooms in this house, each with its own plant, each with its own story. But we'll open that door soon. Now rest your thoughts like a leaf in still water. Let the fern light filter in. You leave the parlor behind and ascend the staircase, which creeps in that particularly Victorian way, half complaint, half performance. The banister is polished, the carpet a faded burgundy, worn thin down the center from generations of firm-footed dignity. Eleanor walks ahead, trailing the scent of violet powder and starch. She opens the door to what she calls the fern room, which is misleading. It is not the only room with ferns. It is simply the room with the most. There is, of course, a fern perched halfway up the landing. It leans toward the window as if eavesdropping on the weather. The walls are green, not painted, but grown. Dozens of Wardian cases, from modest tabletop boxes to one grand glass cabinet the size of a wardrobe. It feels like entering a greenhouse designed by someone who wanted to mourn in style. You begin to wonder if time is subject to fern laws now. The second floor is quieter, even more draped in soft melancholy. Embroidery, letter writing, and attending lectures on geology were considered ideal. There were even published fern guides written just for ladies, with chapters titled How to Pot Without Straining the Wrists and What to Say When Your Specimen Wilts. Anything involving too much enthusiasm was frowned upon, unless, of course, the enthusiasm was directed at plants. This one prefers Schubert, she whispers, as though revealing a crime. Behind it sits a miniature chaise lounge, only large enough for a doll or, possibly, a judgmental squirrel. Eleanor explains that this is her morning fern, a species allegedly cultivated by women who found comfort in watering something after losing a loved one. For a moment, it's not clear if you're looking at or out. Inside it, a miniature woodland scene complete with mossy rocks, tiny ceramic deer, and of course a few theatrical ferns positioned like stage actors humid. There's a faint hissing from a tiny copper kettle in the corner, constantly steaming to maintain the perfect mic. You pause near a curious little setup in the corner, a fern arranged inside, a bell jar atop a lace doily. This was common, apparently, in an age where mourning could last 2 full years and required a rotating collection of black accessories. Ferns became quiet companions. They didn't speak, didn't expect conversation, and if kept just so didn't die. The ideal emotional support entity for the elegantly devastated. One particularly obscure cultural tidbit. Some women trained their ferns using sound. A soft violin played each morning, hoping the vibrations would encourage growth. It's nonsense, Eleanor admits, but quite pleasant nonsense. She shows you a plant with unusually large, velvety leaves. A clock ticks somewhere, but slower here. Victorian women, especially those of Eleanor's social stratum, not, but certainly above common perspiration, had very few respectable hobbies. Terradomania gave women a sanctioned outlet, collecting, arranging, labeling, and showing off their botanical trophies, all within the bounds of virtue and corsetry. Historians still debate whether this was genuine empowerment or simply chlorophyll color distraction. Either way, the Ferns didn't complain. You sit on a settee near the largest Wardian case. It helps me remember, Eleanor murmurs. What do you ask, gently? She tilts her head. That the world is softer than it seems. If you look closely enough, it's hard to argue. The room feels alive in a way few rooms do, like it's inhaling slowly, like it's dreaming. You catch your reflection in the glass. Outside, the rain starts again, as if on cue. Inside, Eleanor offers you a second biscuit. This one is shaped like a fern frond, proverb. Later in the afternoon, or what passes for afternoon in a country, permanently lit by diffused candlelight, you and Eleanor visit the conservatory. It's technically an extension of the house, though entering it feels like crossing a border. Here the glass ceiling arches overhead like a cathedral of mist. The air is thick with humidity and the distant sound of a dripping pipe. Ferns drape themselves from every ledge. Hanging baskets spin lazily. The space smells like wet slate, lemon balm, and possibly smugness. Eleanor adjusts her shawl and points out a specimen near the fountain. According to Eleanor, it thrives on indirect sunlight and emotional distance. This one's from the Sandwich Islands, she says. Arrived last summer. Terribly dramatic. Fossilized fronds were displayed in parlors with reverence. One spiritualist declared them the last whisper of Eden. Others simply enjoyed how they looked next to a fainting couch. She means Hawaii. But Victorians, in their charmingly colonial way, preferred to name things after sandwiches or dukes. You crouch down to examine the fern. Its leaves are sharper, more architectural. It feels like something that might give unsolicited advice. The only problem, ferns don't produce visible seeds. Not to the human eye anyway. Here in the conservatory, ferns become almost mythical. Some have curling tendrils like sea creatures. Others shimmer faintly, their leaves fine as lace. It required patience, an eye for symmetry, and a willingness to live with perpetual failure, as most pressed ferns looked vaguely disappointed by the process. "Show me your fern book," was a genuine sentence uttered at parties. You spot a dried fern in the shape of a small, perfect spiral, and if your fronds had curled too soon, well, you might not get another invitation. One particularly bold plant seems to be attempting an escape through a cracked panel in the roof. Victorians believed ferns had ancient wisdom. A lesser-known belief, Eleanor explains, was the fern seed legend, the idea that fern seeds granted invisibility if collected precisely at midnight on Midsummer's Eve. So how did people collect them, you ask? Badly, Eleanor smirks. Historians still debate whether this myth was a metaphor for hidden knowledge or just an elaborate excuse for midnight picnics. Either way, the ferns remained politely opaque. You pass a table of pressed specimens, flat, brown, and delicately labeled in cursive. Names like Polystichum, Aculeatum, Dryopteris, Felix Moss, and Jeffrey's Regret. That last one is probably not Latin. Pressing ferns was a common hobbicle, parts art and mild punishment. The pressed collections were often bound in leather albums and displayed at Eleanor flips through one of her albums with quiet pride. I found that one on a cliff in Devon, she murmurs. Had to outclimb a goat for it. You do not question her. You sit near the fountain. The water trickles gently. Somewhere, a bird possibly hired for ambience chirps once, then decides that's enough for today. The light is golden now, filtered through grime-streaked glass. The plants seem to glow from within. Eleanor reaches for a watering can shaped like a swan. You don't water a fern, she says. You converse with it. You nod solemnly. Even if it isn't, you lean back. Let the humidity wrap around you like a damp velvet blanket. And you begin to understand, in a world of rules, corsets, and daily disappointments, growing something soft was an act of rebellion. Quiet, green, glorious rebellion. The fern beside you sways slightly. Approvingly, you think, or maybe just from the draft. You wake if you were even fully asleep, still seated in the conservatory. It's dimmer now, the kind of light that gently suggests supper is being considered somewhere else in the house. You stretch just slightly and feel the mild ache of having sat too politely for too long. Eleanor returns, not from any door, but simply from the scene. She always seems to emerge as if summoned by your own curiosity. No tropical drama or aggressively poetic urns. This is where the British native ferns live, the quiet ones, the wallflowers of the plant world, literal wall clingers. In fact, in her hands, she carries a tray. Tea, of course, and what she calls seed cake, which looks more like compressed fog with a crust. You accept a slice, because that's what one does. It tastes vaguely of lemon and faint disappointment. I found them while waiting for a delayed carriage in 1849. Miserable weather, excellent spores. You haven't seen the back garden yet, she says, almost mischievously. You also believe, somehow, that if you wandered into a misty forest, she'd already be there labeling things, sipping tea from a thermos, frowning at a toad. Back garden, as though you haven't already wandered through 6 ecosystems in a damp, glass-sleeved sermon on Mars. But you smile. You're curious. The garden is small, by country estate standards, walled in ivy, bordered in pebbles, and oddly symmetrical. It's not where the statement plants live. Some of them have existed since before flowers, before bees, before the first silly creature crawled out of the sea and wondered what shoes were. There were underground fern markets, not metaphorically underground. Collectors would meet in alleyways, under bridges, even in coal cellars, trading rare spores like contraband. One woman was arrested in Bath for smuggling a blue alpine frond in her parasol. The judge confiscated it and later planted it in his own drawing room. Eleanor walks slowly here, as if stepping between memories. These, she says, motioning to a clump of shaggy green fronds, came from a train station in Yorkshire. You crouch. There's mud on your shoe now, but it feels right. The ferns out here aren't polished. They're honest. They look like they've survived something, possibly multiple somethings. They grow in the cracks, between bricks, behind drains. They seem proud of it. One obscure fact about Victorian England. Eleanor laughs softly when she tells you this. The men had cigars and politics. She says, "We had chlorophyll." You believe her. As the sun begins its slow English descent ever choir setting, always just considering it, you notice a small stone bench. You sit. The bench is cold, but grounding. Eleanor pauses beside you. "Do you know," she says, "that ferns are one of the oldest things alive?" You nod. You've heard this. She continues anyway. It's humbling, isn't it? In a world that celebrates the loud and the blooming, here's a plant that survived by unfurling slowly, preferring the shade and keeping its opinions to itself. You sip your tea, and for once, you don't mind that it's gone slightly cold. Evening falls gently, like a shawl being placed around your shoulders by someone who knows the weight you carry. Eleanor leads you back inside. The walls creak, but less dramatically now, as though the house, too, is settling in. There's no gaslight yet, just the soft glow of candles, placed in reflective sconces to make the room look grander than it really is. Bellwether's Guide to Fern and Fortune. The last one includes a fold-out fortune-telling fern chart. Eleanor assures you it's utter rot, but keeps it bookmarked anyway. Or maybe just to remind the ferns they're not alone. "A gift from my brother," she says. "He thinks I need help managing the staff. Rainwater from Kew," she says, matter-of-factly. "Collected during a thunderstorm in '57. Best for reviving sleepy ferns." You find yourself in a new room. Less formal, more personal. This is her study. Stacks of journals are tucked into corners. Some are scientific, observations upon spores of the northern climes. Others are less so. A treatise on the emotional lives of plants, and Mrs. On her writing desk sits a delicate glass bottle filled with clear liquid. You don't question how water can be sleepy. That way lies madness. There's a soft rustling in the corner, a small wind-up automaton fashioned to look like a gardener baboon's trimming a fake potted plant. Eleanor watches it with amusement. The mood here is different. Less botanical cathedral, more curious attic. This is where she thinks, where she catalogues, where she asks questions that don't have answers. Do ferns dream? She wonders aloud, not to you specifically. They must, don't you think? All that waiting, all that unfurling. Surely they remember something. The baker has a begonia he's rather proud of, though I suspect it's just showing off. Victorians believed in all manner of invisible things, ghosts, magnetic auras, ectoplasm, spiritual correspondences between liver spots and lunar cycles. So why not dreaming plants? One fern supposedly died after its owner had an argument, though, to be fair, it also hadn't been watered in a month. One lesser-known theory from the era claimed that ferns could sense human emotion, not just light or moisture, but the vibes. Historians still debate whether these theories were genuine scientific belief, poetic metaphor, or simply the result of people spending too much time indoors with strong tea and wallpaper fumes. Eleanor shows you a pressed leaf in a frame. It's not a fern, it's a dandelion, faded and fragile, My sister gave me this, she says quietly. Before she left for India, you wait. Not because you expect more, but because silence feels respectful here. The fire crackles. A clock chimes once somewhere between 6 o'clock and eternity. The study grows dimmer. Shadows settle like feathers. Eleanor straightens a stack of papers, then seems to forget why. We'll visit the village tomorrow, she says. You smile, then, almost as an afterthought, she adds, do write down anything interesting you've noticed today. I find one forgets the smallest miracles first. You reach for a page. Your fingers feel heavy, but not tired. The ink smells faintly of lavender. Somewhere outside, the wind moves through the ivy. A fern, forgotten, on a windowsill, curls ever so slightly in its sleep. The next morning arrives not with drama, but with the quiet confidence of fog. You wake to the sound of nothing in particular, just the muted hum of a world not yet caffeinated. Even the birds seem undecided. Eleanor greets you in the breakfast room, already dressed and already judging the marmalade. Orange, she says, is not a personality. The table is laid with more teapots than people, and a vase of fronds of course sits in the center like an honored guest. The sugar bowl is shaped like a hedgehog. You are not allowed to question it. There is a church with an exceptionally mossy gravestone, a bakery with questionable ethics, and a small shop that sells botanical curiosities and sometimes accidentally cheese. Over tea and toast, Eleanor announces the plan. A walk to the village. The road is lined with hedgerows and the occasional judgmental crow. Every few steps, Eleanor stops to point out a fern growing in an unexpected place. Between stones, beneath a rusted gate, once even in the crook of a tree. But first, the wardrobe. Because one must dress properly for fern viewing, even if the ferns are unaware of the effort. It was a competitive hobby. Arguments erupted over taxonomy. One man was banned from a society newsletter for submitting a drawing of a fern that clearly looked like a broom. You are given a walking coat. It smells of lavender and old secrets. There's a single lane, a crooked signpost, and true to Promisar Bakery. The baker, Mr. Tywell, is a large man with small spectacles and an apron patterned with flower handprints. He greets Eleanor like an old debate partner. Eleanor dons a hat decorated with feathers and something green that may or may not still be growing. It's a look. The walk to the village is damp in the way only England can manage, soggy but smug about it. These are the rebels, she says, the unsupervised children of the plant world. You pass a crumbling milestone marker from 1782. A small fern has made its home in the number 8. It looks perfectly content. It is slightly underbaked, but emotionally nourishing. It knows, she says ominously, that I'm watching. An odd fact, in the 19th century, some towns employed fern scouts, unofficial experts who've wandered the countryside logging sightings of rare species. The gravestones lean at awkward angles like people waiting for a bus. One is nearly covered in moss and fern alike. You begin to suspect her relationships with plants may be more fulfilling than those with humans. Inside, a biscuit shaped like a fern. Mr. Tywell pretends not to notice. Eleanor was never officially a scout. Too many rules, she sniffs, and the trousers were dreadful. Another said they grew when the buried had been fond of tea, which, given England, means most graves are. You arrive at the village, which appears out of the fog like a stage set built by someone with strong opinions about chimney height. Inside, the air smells of fresh bread, sugar glaze, and ambition. Your begonia's wilting, she says, by way of hello. It's dignified, he replies. Not everything needs to be doing. They squabble for several minutes about the ethics of forced blooming. Eleanor insists on showing you the begonia, anyway. It lives on a shelf by the window, clearly regretting its decisions. On your way out, she hands you a small paper bag. You pass the churchyard next. This, Eleanor whispers, is where I first met Dryapterus. Delita Tarda. It was love at first spore. She kneels reverently, brushes a leaf with her gloved hand. One peculiar belief in the countryside was that ferns growing on graves signified a soul at peace. As the church bell tolls somewhere behind you, Eleanor sighs. I think the ferns need dusting. You return slowly, the fog beginning to lift. The ferns, presumably, await. Back at the house, the air feels heavier, not ominous, just thicker, like the rooms have absorbed the weather. Eleanor removes her coat with theatrical flair and immediately disappears into what she calls the lab. You are invited, though what constitutes a lab, you soon discover, is more creative than scientific. It's a converted pantry, really lined with drying racks, labeled bottles, jars of mysterious powders, and enough tweezers to raise questions. In one corner, a makeshift desk with notebooks stacked like this is where the magic doesn't happen, she says cheerfully. Most people don't care about these, she says. Too small, too quiet. She holds up a small, shriveled object. Root ball, she explains. Not currently behaving. It involves two separate gametes seeking each other across moisture, like a damp version of a Jane Austen novel. There is longing, there is chemistry, there are spores flung into the void on a hope and a breeze. You nod. A spleenwort meant, a heart-stung fern meant. I cannot speak my love aloud. A bracken somehow meant you smell like Sundays. Not all messages translated well. It looks like a dot, maybe less. She gestures to a tray of petri dishes, each containing a delicate fern gameta. She lights a small lamp. It flickers like it's shy. But here's where the story starts. She walks you through fern reproduction in more detail than strictly necessary. It is, to your surprise, rather romantic. You hold up one of the dishes, but Eleanor beams at it like it's a newborn. Historians still debate, she says, whether the Victorian fern craze was more science or sentiment, but I say why choose. One obscure tidbit. During the height of fern fever, lovers exchanged pressed fronds in envelopes with cryptic meanings. Eleanor pulls a drawer and reveals a bundle of these notes. I saved a few, she says, strictly for taxonomy. You glance over the faded ink, the careful script. You're very fond of secrets, you say. She smiles. Only the green one. Outside, the clouds shift. A single sunbeam slips through the conservatory roof, lighting a fern in dramatic spotlight. You half expect it to bow. Eleanor begins misting her cases again. You don't have to water every plant daily, she admits, but you can. She hands you a tiny brass spritzer. You oblige, it feels ceremonial. The mist hangs in the air like memory. You spritz again. The fern glistens. And maybe, just maybe, it glistens back. By late afternoon, the house has quieted into that particular hush that only happens when all the clocks are ticking in agreement. You find yourself back in the drawing room. The fire crackles with just enough energy to seem productive. Eleanor is seated in her armchair, stitching something that might be a pillowcase or might be a protest banner. It reads, in tiny, embroidered cursive, "Proud to be photosynthetic." She doesn't comment on it, neither do you. Instead, she gestures toward a small wooden box on the side table. "Open it," she says. Inside, a collection of fern-themed calling cards, each one with a name, a quote, and, in most cases, a pressed frond, pressed lovingly into the paper. They are the souvenirs of a forgotten social trend among pterodomaniacs to greet each other with botanical introductions. One reads, "Mrs. Lavinia Copps, I cultivate both virtue and dread." Another, "Miss Charlotte Prune, maidenhairs soothe the soul. Bachelors need not inquire." Eleanor fans through them fondly, like old letters from polite earnest little verses published in gardening journals and shared during society meetings. Most of them were bad, but beautifully bad, the kind of poetry that rhymes leaf with grief and calls moss the velvet of sorrow. There were competitions, she said. Who could press the cleanest frond, match the best quote, make the cleverest fern pun? You find one that simply says, "Be frondly." Of course it does. One peculiar cultural trend during this period was fern poetry. Eleanor recites one for you. "O frond so fine, thy curls divine." A leaf taps gently against the glass, like a guest, unsure of its welcome. She unlocks it with a key shaped like a leaf. "Do shiver when I breathe the mind." There is a beat of silence. Then she shrugs. It was a simpler time. You begin to realize they weren't just for fun. They were identity statements of taste and self-worth disguised as stationery. In a society where a woman could not vote, not own property, not walk alone without commentary, perhaps she could still choose a favorite fern. And perhaps that was something. Outside, a breeze rustles the ivy on the windows. You look again at the cards. Eleanor sets her embroidery aside. "Come," she says. "I want to show you something before it wilts." You follow her through a narrow hallway to a door you hadn't noticed before. Behind it, the winter room. The winter room is cold, by design, but not unfriendly. It smells faintly of cedar and dry soil. Here Eleanor keeps the ferns that do not like warmth or attention. The difficult ones, the shy ones, she murmurs. They don't care if you're royal or ruined. They grow anyway. The ones that, in her words, whether it worked, no one knows but the ferns. If they held grudges, never said so. Prefer melancholy as a mood, she says, are the only things that don't ask me to smile. It feels oddly reverent. She says, not failures, just miscommunications. You wrap your shawl tighter as you step in. Frost has kissed the edges of the windows, and a faint mist curls at the baseboards like a sleepy cat. Not less alive, just less eager to prove it. The plants here are quieter. This one's from Scandinavia, Eleanor says, pointing to a low, is the graveyard. She adds, the ones who didn't quite thrive. I don't throw them out. I let them try again. pale green fern with delicate lobes. It prefers the dark and conversations about mythology. She brushes a bit of snowmelt off a clay pot and sighs. Ferns are funny. She leads you to a stone trough where several ferns grow in a messy, overgrown tangle. This, she says. You blink. Not literal. Eleanor opens it. After all, keeping a greenhouse required skill, patience, chemistry, bookkeeping, and social navigation. It was part salon, part science lab, part sanctuary, revealing hand-drawn sketches, notes in faded ink, little bits of moss taped carefully to the page. She touches one gently. It's mostly brown, but not entirely. There's a green nub, trying. You watch, in silence, one obscure Victorian belief. Some gardeners whispered apologies to their plants before pruning. It was thought to encourage regrowth and discourage bad botanical karma. You notice a journal on the shelf beside the failed propagations. Historians still debate whether women like Eleanor were mere hobbyists or quiet revolutionaries. Eleanor closes the book with care. Plants. The wind moans softly outside. You stay a while longer in the winter room. The air is cold but honest. A fern leaf, dried at the tip, trembles faintly. You think it might be dreaming. The next morning arrives wrapped in fog again, as if the sky itself has had enough and decided to wear a shawl. You step softly through the hallway toward the kitchen, following the scent of toast, wet leaves, and whatever Eleanor considers breakfast. She greets you in slippers and a deeply suspicious apron. We're having eggs today, she announces, but mostly for moral support. The eggs are served with a side of watercress and a tiny vase of fern leaves that Eleanor insists adds to the digestive mood. You're not entirely sure what that means, but the eggs are fine, and the watercress is combative. After breakfast, Eleanor lays out her agenda for the day. It's written on parchment in looping script and includes the following. 10 o'clock. Missed all cases. 10:30. Judge the bracken in the east corner. 11 o'clock. Read excerpts from the Ferns of Devonshire out loud to the cat. 11:30. Quiet reflection with the Asplenium. Naturally, are invited to participate in all activities, though the cat is not currently accepting visitors. Some believed it was a betrayal of its friendly essence. She slices it cleanly, places it between paper, layers it into the press, and tightens the straps. Others felt it was the only way to preserve fleeting botanical beauty. Letters were written, gloves were probably adjusted past Lady Wrinklefern of Sussex, but as Eleanor tightens the press with slow care, you suspect it's more than that. There's tenderness here, a need to remember something fragile, even if imperfectly. Eleanor opens a cabinet and reveals something new. A collection of Victorian fern pressing kits. Little wooden boxes with straps, felt pads, blotting paper, and tiny knives for slicing with appropriate enthusiasm. Some are engraved with initials. One has a locket built into the lid. Portable romance, she calls it, or portable grief, depending on your mood. One odd historical tidbit. There were actual debates in fern societies about whether one should ever press a fern. Eleanor demonstrates the process with dramatic flourish. She selects a fresh front ender, symmetrical, utterly unaware of its fate. There, she says. Now it lives forever, or at least until mildew. You help label the specimen. Its name. Historians still debate whether Victorians loved nature or simply needed to control something that wouldn't talk back. Tea? She asks suddenly. You nod. Always yes to tea. And the morning moves on quiet, leafy, deliberate. Later that day, the fog lifts just enough to reveal the world hasn't ended. You and Eleanor step outside again, this time with wicker baskets and a small brass trowel. She's decided it's time to forage. Forage for what? You ask. Truth, she replies, and possibly some morse. You follow, slightly less nimble, marveling at how much she sees that you don't. You head toward the wooded path that wraps behind the estate. It's shaded, damp, full of low stone walls and slightly haunted birds. Ferns line the route like old friends, pretending not to recognize each other. Eleanor crouches often, inspecting moss patches and poking beneath rocks. There's a theory, she says, brushing aside a bit of leaf litter. It looks suspiciously like 3 others you've passed, but she's delighted. Just enough for the west window. It's looking lonely. She kneels, brushes dirt from its base, and begins gently prying it up. That we only see the plants we feel emotionally compatible with. You blink. She continues. That's why my cousin never notices She's a dreadful optimist. You pass a stream. It babbles softly, like it's trying not to interrupt. You watch as she transfers a tiny patch of fresh moss into it, with surgical precision. Eleanor finds a fern she hasn't seen before, or so she claims. I won't take all of it, she says. One obscure Victorian practice. Moss gardens inside snuff boxes. Yes, people actually carried small living patches of moss in decorative tins. They'd open them at social gatherings, gaze lovingly into the greenery, and sigh dramatically. It was the original fidget toy, but with chlorophyll. Eleanor has 3 of these boxes. She carries one now, clipped to her belt. There, she says, a traveling forest. You head back as the light begins to fade. The ferns along the path seem to bow in the wind, or maybe just in agreement. As you approach the house, she pauses. You know, she says, almost offhand, the thing about ferns is, they never bloom. You nod. They are loved. And yet, inside, she adds the new specimen to her window shelf. The west side does look less lonely now. She doesn't say thank you, but the fern does. It's nearly evening now. The sky, having struggled all day to pick a mood, finally settles on wistful You're back in the conservatory, which looks different in twilight quietude. The glass walls reflect soft lamplight, and the blur of ivy outside. That one's turning inward, she says, probably thinking about mortality or root rot. The ferns cast long, feathery shadows, like dancers frozen mid. Eleanor is watering, as always, in slow circular motions. She hums an unplaceable tune, something between a lullaby and a hymn to chlorophyll. Her watering can has a name, apparently. Sir Dewsbury, you choose not to ask. She pauses and nods at the case near the window. You were to sleep with a frond under your pillow, and in the morning, the shape of your dreams would appear on its surface. A soft patter of rain starts up again, gently tapping on the glass roof like a sleepy audience applauding the sky. Ferns understand us more than we deserve. This naturally led to a surge in fern-based dream journals, mostly full of anxious scribbles and unhelpful advice like avoid cheese before bed. You crouch beside the fern in question. It does look contemplative. She shows it to you, cracked leather cover, yellowed pages filled with scrawled drawings of ferns, annotated with poetic guesses. Whether it was science disguised as sentiment or sentiment disguised as science, the truth probably lies somewhere in the mist between. One odd Victorian belief, truly odd, even by their generous standards. Eleanor actually owns one of these journals. July 3rd, frond curled at tip. Suspect dream involved unresolved longing, possibly about buttons. October 9th, leaflet pattern suggests desire to flee or indigestion. You sit on the small wooden bench and watch the room dim. Eleanor lights a small oil lamp. The flame flickers and casts shadows that ripple across the leaves like old film. I used to think ferns were fragile, she says, but they're not. You're not, of course not. They're just quiet. Like some people, they take their time. They don't rush to be admired. Historians still debate whether the Victorian obsession with ferns was about escapism or order. The lamp crackles softly. Eleanor adjusts a fern leaf with tweezers, then steps back and observes it like a painting. It's almost right, she says. You suspect she means more than the arrangement. The last room you visit is one you didn't know existed, the attic. Eleanor insists. It's where the stories go when they're full. The door creaks open to reveal, not dust and cobwebs, as expected, but a meticulously organized sanctuary. You follow her up a narrow staircase, past shelves of flower pots, old journals, dried petals stored in glass jars, and one very startled moth. This is her fern archive. Dozens of shelves, each stacked with flat cases. Inside, pressed fronds, hand-drawn diagrams, notes on soil acidity, emotional status reports, not of major events, but of quiet ones, the ones that usually slip through the cracks of history. Some pages include pressed items from trips, train tickets, napkins, dried tea leaves. All these survived 3 storms and 1 undercooked scone. You pull out a file labeled Ireland, 1856. Rainy but brave. Inside, 5 pressed ferns and a note reading. Each specimen is a memory, a time capsule. Eleanor opens a drawer and pulls out a faded sketch. It's a portrait of her, younger, standing beside a towering fern nearly her height. My first collection, she says, voice hushed. She doesn't say where it was or why she left it behind, naming their plants after extinct birds. You flip through a shelf of tags and read names like dodo, passenger, giant mower, like the day is exhaling its last warm breath. Eleanor explains, it made them feel less extinct, somehow. Instead, she turns to you and hands you a small blank book, and somewhere in the hush, a fern opens just a little. Yours, she says, for what you find, caring so much for something that doesn't even bloom. You're not sure you deserve it, but you accept one peculiar habit among certain fern collectors. There's something heartbreakingly human about that. She closes the last drawer, and you both sit on the small wooden step at the attic window. Below, The garden ferns wave gently in the wind. You watch them in silence. I suppose, Eleanor says at last, that it's silly, isn't it? You shake your head. Not silly at all. The wind rattles the ivy. The attic glows faintly in amber light. It's night now, the kind of night that doesn't announce itself with thunder or drama, but simply as the stars are out, most of them hiding behind a thin veil of clouds like shy guests at their own party. A low fire glows, not out of necessity, but as a quiet companion. The room smells of lavender oil and old paper. She's seated with her legs tucked under her like a house. You join her, and she nods once, as if to say, "You've earned it." Eleanor has retired to her sitting room. On the table before you lies a scrapbook, thick, leather-bound, and fraying nobly at the corners. You open it. Occasionally, she hums a tune you don't recognize, and perhaps neither does she. You rest your hand on the cover of the book. It's that they don't care if you do. Inside, years of fern specimens, pressed carefully, labeled with dates, locations, weather conditions. The shadows lengthen and soften, blurring the sharp edges of the furniture. The room begins to feel like memory. August 5th, 1854. Brighton. Fern, slightly crushed by grief, but recoverable. You page through it slowly. Each entry feels like a whisper from a quieter version of the world. Eleanor says nothing. She sips her tea, lets the clock tick. She looks at you not quite directly and says, "You know, the thing about collecting ferns isn't that they last you not." Somehow, that's comforting. She rises to place another log on the fire. It crackles obligingly. You feel the warmth slowly stretch toward your feet. Just a single pressed frond slipped into a sleeve or pocket. Something to hold on to in the earth. Something old, familiar, and unconcerned. One final oddity about Victorian some were buried with them. Not bouquets. Eleanor picks up her embroidery again. It's a new piece. A delicate spiral of green thread, growing outward. "No flowers," she says. "Just ferns. That's enough." And you believe her. You sit in the stillness a little longer. Outside, the wind moves softly through the garden. Inside, nothing moves at all except the shadows. And time. The hour is late now. Even the ferns have stopped growing for the evening. The fire is down to embers. The clock ticks more slowly than it should, as if it, too, is winding down. You shift in your chair. The cushions welcome you. The silence embraces you. Condensation beads along its roof. A gentle sigh sealed in glass. The ferns inside rest easy, curled gently into themselves like sleeping cats. In the corner, the Wardian case glows faintly in the last flicker of firelight. You remember the silence of the winter room, the stillness of the attic drawer, the feeling of something ancient being held without needing to explain itself. Outside, the ivy hugs the stone walls. The garden settles, leaf by leaf. The world leans in, and you hear, no feel soft around the edges. Thoughts come more slowly, breaths more easily. You remember the walk, the moss, the pressed frond, named Lady Ring. You remember Eleanor, wrapped in shawls and certainty. You don't need to explain yourself either. You are here, you are safe. You are nothing more or less than a gently spiraling story in the dark. The night cradles the house. The ferns dream quietly, the wind becomes a whisper, and your thoughts drift like spores, floating gently toward rest. Let them land where they will. You don't have to know where, you only have to sleep softly now. Good night.